Hello, and welcome to another conversation about conversations. My name is Ivan Farber. I'm the host of this podcast, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Mr. Alex Brown. Alex is in sales, and he's involved in both client acquisition and sales strategy. He's been a previous guest twice before, and Alex, I'm welcoming you back for a third time, so you get a bonus parting gift on the way out of here. But Alex, a sincere welcome back to Conversations About Conversations.
Well, thanks for having me. They always say third time's a charm.
Alex, I had in mind that we would discuss 4 items today. Would you like to know what those 4 items are?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
Great question.
So,
Great question.
Questions. Yeah, there you go. That was a question. The crux of chapter 2 of the book, which is what I'm focused on this month, is using questions skillfully. And it's not about asking questions, because we all ask questions, but it's using them for a purpose, for an intention, to both guide a conversation, to create the outcomes that we want, and it's doing it with skill. So there's 4 things we're going to take on and talk about. Number 1, we're going to talk about open-ended questions, what they are, how they're best used. Number 2, we're going to talk about closed-ended questions, what they are and how they're best used. Third, we're going to talk about 4 question asking principles that are just good principles to follow. And then lastly, we're going to talk about combining your question types in a sequence.
I like it. Okay.
Very good. So before we get going though, is there any opening statement that you'd like to make before we head into things?
Yeah, as I read chapter 2, I've read it now 4 times, actually 5 if you count the original time when you first published. And the thing that strikes me is that the questions themselves can be, fairly so-so questions. But I think to your point, it's the sequence of questions. And again, this goes back to art and science, and this ties right in with the rapport sandwich that we talked about in chapter 1. You have to be able to apply different questions based on the voice on the other end of the phone or the voice in a real face-to-face conversation. And I was thinking about it today. I made 31 outbound calls today total. And one of the questions that I often use is kind of unique. And, it's interesting because I'm often trying to get through the gatekeeper, the administrative assistant or the person at the front desk, to get to the person I'm trying to reach. And one of the things I've found that works really well is to pause and say, hey, I'm trying to reach so-and-so. And they go, okay, that's your point. And I say something along these lines. I say, the reason I ask is because I didn't know if he has voicemail or if I could leave that message with you. And I know your time's important. And that makes them feel valued, number 1. And number 2, it's almost a stall technique because they're just answering the phone all day, and finally someone is showing a little interest in them. And 9 times out of 10, I'm also trying to clarify if I have the right owner of the business. And what this does is it allows me to kind of develop some dialogue, and they often will give me their name, and I put that in my CRM, and now I know the gatekeeper's name. I've verified the information, and now I can leave a message. But in 2 or 3 questions, I've accomplished a lot, and they don't know it. It's a very interactive form of questions, and they're fairly, it starts out closed end, and then I might have one open-ended questions. But these are just quick hits to try and figure out, do I have the right people? What's their name? And I'm showing some respect for their time.
It's courteous.
Yes. Yeah.
And it is amazing when you just ask for the first name, it changes the entire dynamic of the conversation.
Yeah, because everyone likes to hear their name, right? If I say Ivan, that's so true.
Yeah, Alex, of course.
Right. You like to hear, we could probably put probes on our head and find out that our sensories, some synapses firing up there saying, yes, I heard my name.
Yeah, well, people have been calling our name for as long as we can remember.
That's right.
So 31 calls, and would you say 31 gatekeepers?
No, probably 28. I did actually reach 2 or 3 people that had picked up, surprisingly, their own office phone, or it was a cell phone in one case.
And is that a typical day for you?
Yeah, I set a personal goal of a certain number of calls, but yeah, I think 30 to 50 is the goal typically.
And how would you assess your use of questions and your level of skill?
After reading this chapter 4 times, I think every time I come back, and it's human nature to be overly confident and to really think you're doing great. And I think you mentioned it in your book when one of your tormentors said, yeah, you really don't know how to establish rapport and your questions really aren't that great. And so it takes many iterations. And the way that I like to think of it is I have a sheet, my daily call log. I don't know if you can see that. And then it's got number of calls, number of emails, LinkedIn, response, people that responded, and then if I've sent them something and they've said they've agreed to next steps. So the way that I know that I'm doing the questions right is quantifiable. I want to reach 3 to 5 people a day and set up at least 1 or 2 phone calls for a further discussion.
Got it.
And so I think that's one way that one can measure themselves, is an objective sense. It's not always that easy. Maybe other people listening to this will say, well, I don't keep track of my stuff. But you're like me, you have an Excel spreadsheet that tracks every call. I find that tracking stuff matters. It allows you to compare, and maybe you tweak the questions and find out that, boy, that's actually working. I can see a cause and effect. What do you think?
Okay, but I asked you a question.
You did.
And you did not answer it. So how would you assess, which is fine, and I'm demonstrating follow-up questions.
Sure. No, yeah, go ahead. So
how would you assess your ability?
I would say that I'm okay.
Uh-huh.
I'll give myself a C.
Okay. So
and one of the reasons why I give myself a C, since I think that might be the follow-up question, is I tend to ask 2 questions at a time.
Mm-hmm.
I catch myself trying to throw in, 2 questions. And so I have to force myself to pause and listen.
I evaluated myself earlier today when I posted something about using questions skillfully. And I noted that everybody thinks they're an above average driver.
Yeah.
Right. And I looked and said, well, there are a lot of things I could do better with questions. I mean, being intentional all the time, not just some of the time, thinking through the sequence of questions. I would give myself like a B or a B plus. And, but I think most people C or below, or not even taking the test, not even getting there. So, okay, let's dive into open-ended questions.
Yeah.
There are, first of all, to define what is an open-ended question. You want to take that?
Yeah, I think the way that I think of open-ended questions are I call it the journalism 5 questions, the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, why, how, and then how is the only H. And those questions, if you just remember, think of yourself like Superman as a reporter, not Superman, but Clark Kent?
Yeah, Clark Kent.
Yeah, Clark Kent. And you think about the questions one would ask as a reporter, you would want to know who, what, where, when, and why. And if you write those down, or if you're a visual person, in your mind, seeing those will elicit open-ended, long responses. You can't answer them comfortably anyway with a yes or no. So an example might be, Ivan, what is your favorite open-ended question? And you can't just say yes or no. You're going to have to answer it. So that's my question. What's your favorite open-ended question? Or do you have one?
I do. The question is, what do you mean by that?
And why do you think that's your favorite? Just out of curiosity, what is it about that question, and what are the responses that it drives for you?
Well, one, why I think the upbringing of growing up in a household of mental health practitioners, my father being a psychiatrist, my mother being a psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that would be a pretty common mental health practitioner thing to say. But also just in the conversations I've had with people, what I find is that what you think someone meant and what they think they meant are not usually the same. Sometimes what you think they meant is nothing anywhere close to what they meant, or they didn't really mean what they said. It reminds me of the what Horton Hears a Who. I said what I meant, and I meant what I said.
Yeah.
An elephant's faithful 100%, something like that. But I think people in general haven't really thought through what they are about to say, and so they don't know what they mean.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it's a clarifying question. I think you give an example in the book of someone saying, "How come you don't have any micro caps or small caps in my portfolio?" And you're like, "Wait a minute, can you explain what a small cap is, or can you help me define that? You know, what do you mean by that?" And they're like, and then they give you this answer, and you're like, "Well, that's not at all what most people would define as a small cap." So I think you're absolutely right. Clarifying, making sure you're on the same page is something that I certainly jump over. But in the book, when I read that, I thought, I need to clarify what do they actually mean by that, and get to the real heart of it.
What's your favorite open-ended question?
I still, and I shared it with you last time, what do you think about the future? You really get people interested, and it's fascinating to hear what people have to say. I don't know about you, but I find asking that question, I'm often either elated to hear what someone says, or I'm absolutely just shaking my head, saying, I can't believe this person said that. So it's fun. It's a good thing. I'm not mad ever. I just think, holy cow, we're not on the same page, or we are.
Right. And some active listening. What do you mean by that? Tell me more about that. It really shows a skillful use of questions when you do that.
It does. And one thing I think too is that it makes the person feel cared for, or genuinely. I think that the fact that one is genuine enough and showing interest, and not just how's the weather, how are you, tell me more about you, but making it as specific as possible. And it has to be genuine. I don't think the question should even be asked. If you're genuinely not interested, my vote would be don't ask it unless you truly want to know, because they're going to be able to tell if you sound like a script.
Right. Like if you're just being transactional.
Yeah.
Then nobody likes to feel like a transaction. There are 4 things that open-ended questions do that are separate and distinct from what closed-ended questions do. And I want to list them off, and then we'll unpack them one by one.
Okay.
So the first thing that open-ended questions do is it generates dialogue. The second is it directs the conversation and forwards the action. The third is you can elicit facts and feelings, motivations, needs, and wants.
Mm-hmm.
And the fourth is you can help foster learning and understanding. All right, so let's unpack now that we see what's in the suitcase. We can pull the things out of the suitcase. So first one was generate dialogue. How do you think an open-ended question generates dialogue?
Well, it feels more interactive, clearly, because you can answer it any way you want. A closed-ended question, you're sort of boxed in a corner. And I think people want flexibility, and they want to express themselves and be individually expressing their true feelings. And I think open end is just great. You don't know where it's going to go. And I think the other side of that, so that's what the person responding is, and I'd love to hear what you have to say. But I think that the person asking the questions is excited too, because they don't know where it's going to go. So it creates this dynamic of, I don't know where we're headed, but we're going to just go and see where it goes. It's a flow.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
What are your thoughts? I'd love to hear what you think.
What are your thoughts? Open-ended question.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's essential. I'll often talk about using conversations to guide a conversation, and using questions to guide a conversation. And I don't really know how I would guide a conversation without it.
Mm-hmm.
I came to the point of view a few years back that the person doing the talking is not necessarily the person in control of the conversation. It's actually the person asking the questions who is in control of driving where the conversation is going. But I can't even imagine taking the approach that I take as a relationship manager of being consultative, needs-based, and collaborative. I can't even imagine doing that without asking questions. So it's indispensable.
Yeah, that's a great word. Indispensable. I think that's perfect.
Thank
Perfect.
you.
Yeah, no, it's good. In fact, I wrote down, this may be a time to think about it. We can keep talking about open-ended, but good questions inform, great questions transform.
Ooh.
And I really thought about that when I wrote that down. And that's a quote from Ken Coleman, so I'm
Okay.
not taking credit for it. But when you think about it, a good question absolutely gives you some meat. But a great question, it transforms the whole relationship, the dialogue, and it truly transforms things. And I think that's the difference between being a good questioner and being a great questioner.
That's profound. I never heard that one before.
Yeah, I read it and I thought, that is so true. Think back to some of those questions you asked. And one for me that I keep going to is, how do you think about the future? And suddenly the person's telling me all about their personal life, their faith, their charity, their family. And I'm thinking one question, and I know this person better than I probably know some friends that I've had for 10 years, because I've never said, tell me how you think about the future. And it also typically you have, it guides you into a whole nother set of questions that become deeper, and you're getting to that need or the emotion, whatever you're trying to drive towards. So I think there's a transformative ability in really good sequence of questions.
And it's really brilliant. I didn't realize you were going to deliver such a zinger, and and I was going to compliment you for coming up with that. I'm glad. It's nice that you are being humble, but it's really true, right? Some questions give you information. Now I'm gonna take a little bit different way of saying it, and maybe I can copyright it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
some conversations give you information, while others give you transformation.
yeah. I think that's exactly right. You know, another way of saying this that salesmen are really, you've heard this many times. Facts tell and stories sell. And the best example I've heard is this travel agent kept hearing from these people that the Sydney Opera House is set at 72 degrees, and they're like, who cares? And then finally someone had the was smart enough to tell the travel agent, you know why they do that? And the travel agent said, no, I've heard this 1,000 times and I don't care. And they said, that's so the instruments stay in tune. That's the ideal temperature. And all that travel agent had to do was ask the question, why do they keep it at 72.5 instead of just pushing it to the side? And I think asking those questions of the why, and I think there's a bunch of people talking about the why. And one of my favorite books, which I think you and I have spoken about before, is Man's Search for Meaning. Mm-hmm. Frankl, who survived the Holocaust. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, you can endure anything if you understand the why. Mm-hmm. And, oftentimes we ask the how, the what, the who, but the why, that why is just so important. What's driving the goal, or what's the background? And that why, to me, that's the one that you have to build to. If you ask why from the beginning, I'm not going to tell you if I didn't know you. So to me, the sequence of questions is all getting to the last W. The why. Why is that? Why do you care? Why do you think that way about the future?
Yeah, what do you mean by that, and why do you think that way?
That's right.
That would be a good example of a successful sequence.
But they're not going to give you or me or anyone the agency if we lead with, well, why do you feel that way? And they're like, wait a minute. Let's start with the who and the what we're talking about. Then let's get into the why. And I've had that mistake where I'm trying to jump ahead, and clearly that doesn't work well. It doesn't work. It doesn't flow.
There's that word again.
Yeah.
All right. So we use open-ended questions to generate dialogue, to direct the action, to forward the movement of the conversation towards something mutually beneficial. We have to use them to get the facts and the feelings. And in a lot of ways, we can use them to foster learning and understanding. Now let's switch to the alter ego of open-ended questions, and that is closed-ended questions.
Yeah.
So what in your definition is a closed-ended question?
Something that can be answered with a one-word answer, typically a yes or a no or correct or incorrect. And it typically is just a way to not feel like you're having to have them speak the whole time. And you can use it as a pause just to clarify or make sure you heard it correctly. So what I think you're saying is you definitely would like to move on to the next step. Yes.
Yes.
No, that's not what I said. Okay, well, then what I need to let's talk about that, and then go back. But you're checking in often or giving a pause to make sure that what you're hearing is correct, and then going back to another open-ended question. But if I ask you 5 open-ended questions right from the get-go, it can feel like an interrogation instead of a dialogue. And I think the closed-end questions can sometimes be a great pause or check-in. And I think that's what from what you read or what you published in the book, I think you did a very good job of saying it's a rodeo. You gave this example of a rodeo, which elicits this, kind of crazy visual for me because I watched rodeos growing up, and it's so true because you don't know where the bull's going to go or the conversation's going to go, and it's a great metaphor. The bottom line is the rodeo in this case is the conversation. And you don't know if you're going to be spun around right from the get-go. And so you need to have a whole bunch of potential questions in your bag, so to speak, to pull them out. And if you have only open-ended questions, I can tell you, my experience doesn't work so well. And those closed-ended questions can be great advancers or check-ins.
Yes.
What would you say, though? What would you say about closed-ended questions? Because I know we both use both.
Yes. When I say alter ego, it's not like one is the good kind and the other is the bad kind. They just do very different functions. The real game changer for me was realizing, when do I use one versus the other? But I call them the Dr. Seuss questions. So yeah, the journalist questions are open-ended: who, what, when, where, why, and how. The Dr. Seuss questions after the book, Green Eggs and Ham. Green Eggs and Ham has, I think, it's like 57 words. That's it. And so there's a lot of repetition of the questions. Would you eat it with a fox? Would you eat it in a box? Would you like it here or there? Will you eat it anywhere? Do you like green eggs and ham? And so it's all closed-ended questions. Did you, are you, do you, have you, would you, could you, should you, may I? And yes, just like the way you defined it, it's going to get a yes, a no, or a very quick answer, and doesn't give the person you're talking with a lot of freedom.
Sort of boxes them into kind of a bifurcated choice, one or two.
A box, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you like it on a box?
Yeah.
With a goat.
With a goat.
Here or there.
I need
anywhere.
to reread that to our 9-year-old tonight. Yeah. I love that book growing up.
So, but there are 5 things that you can do with a closed-ended question and where they're best used. And those 5 are: 1, if you need a quick answer, like, are you available at 4 for the meeting?
Right.
Yes. To check for acceptance of what you've put forward. That's a very important role. And as we talk more about the different concepts in the book, checking for acceptance at each stage of the conversation is fundamental.
Agreed.
Do you agree?
I would agree. Yeah, I would agree.
Checking for acceptance.
Yeah, you just did it. Yeah, and it felt very collaborative. It doesn't feel like you're just. And I love that you're asking me, do I agree? Sure, I agree. You're right.
The third way they're used is just that: is either checking for acceptance or determining if you have agreement for sure. So there's one thing is like, do you follow? Check. Do you agree?
Right.
Now you're checking that. The fourth way they're used is actually to make a statement or a point. And this one came to me in a training that I did probably about 20 years ago when I was a seminar leader, and it was a presentation for seminars. And they were saying, like, when you're taking questions at the end of your presentation, pretty much none of the questions are questions. They're statements. In the financial line of work, adult people often say, are you concerned, or not that we should go politics, but
Right.
are you concerned about the new administration? For example,
Yep.
someone asks you that. Well, what they're essentially saying is, I'm concerned about the new administration, but they put it in the form of a question.
Right. Right.
Sometimes there's some dishonest dealing by asking it as a question, but that's probably a tangent that I don't need to go down right now. But either way, when someone asks a closed-ended question, what I encourage everybody listening to this podcast is to think about the statement that is in that question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I remember doing some of those seminars with you, and people would ask those questions, and they were really projecting their view of something in the form of a question. And I think your example is great, and yeah, I remember distinctly you would force them to kind of come out of their shell with usually a follow-up question. Well, what specifically are you saying that we should be concerned about? You would turn it on them in a productive and professional way,
Mhm.
but then they would be forced to say, well, actually what I'm concerned about, and then they would come out. And I remember doing that. You and I traveled many different two states primarily, doing these speeches for this large brokerage firm. And I remember thinking at the end, boy, a lot of these statements are, and you and I talked about it, a lot of these statements are opinion in the form of a question. To your point, they're not really a question. They are trying to just say what they want to say.
Right. But on the flip side, now that you know that, you can make a point by asking a closed-ended question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I haven't thought about it like that. I mean, I've read it in your book, but I need to think more about how I do that, or how I can get better at that. And I think that's a great point.
Now, here's a key distinction about closed-ended questions. The fifth way they can be used is not an asset, it's a liability. Because the function of a closed-ended question is what we've talked about. Get a quick answer, get acceptance, determine if you gain agreement, make a statement or a point. But the problem with them is that they typically will cause you to lose the ability to direct the conversation.
Because the recipient thinks this is another closed-ended question, or why is that?
Let's do an example. So
Sure.
I'll be you cold calling,
Yep.
and I get the gatekeeper and I say, Mr. Gatekeeper, do you know when the big boss will be available?
3:00.
Do you think I could have an appointment at 3?
Who are you?
Right. So I'm after.
So you haven't earned agency, you haven't identified. Yeah, you're jumping ahead. You're putting the cart before the horse, in my opinion.
Yeah. What I have observed, and this is by no means an exhaustive scientific research study, but when I listen to cold callers, which I do not very often, but when I've done it, and I put a tick mark on a piece of paper for every open-ended question, every closed-ended question.
Yeah.
My belief, my assertion is that about 80% of questions asked in our society are closed-ended.
I think that anecdotal evidence would be backed up by a broad study, because I would say the exact same thing. If you hold yourself accountable and you just kind of record a conversation and you're not very deliberate with your open-ended questions, I did this a few times and I was like 70% closed-ended.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it was kind of an eye-opener, really, because you're not advancing, to your point earlier. If you want to create true dialogue and genuine interest in advancing and doing these things we talked about, you have to have not only open-ended questions, but a sequence in your mind, because you're directing it toward a specific goal.
So there's so many closed-ended questions. You absolutely differentiate yourself if you use a combination of open and closed, and really think about it more like a chess match and a sequence. But that's the big point I want people to take away, is that if you're using closed-ended questions, you're mostly making statements. You're not eliciting facts and feelings. You're not going to have a transformative conversation. You will get some information, but many times you'll just hit a dead end pretty quickly. That's the big takeaway, is when, and I'm a big fan of metaphors and analogies. And to me, the open-ended questions are to opening a window as closed-ended questions are to closing a window. Like
Yeah.
if you really want to create a dialogue and get an opening into, your prospect's world, you're not going to do it by, hey, do you know why I'm calling? No. Well, are you interested in learning more about what we have to offer? No.
Yeah.
And then you get to tic-tac-no, where you ask a third closed-ended question and you're sunk. All right, I want to go over 4 question asking principles. First one, and you alluded to this earlier, asking one question at a time.
Yeah.
And even beyond that, I feel like the best opening questions are 3 to 7 word questions.
Yeah, that's in your book too, and I found that very interesting, but shorter, sweeter in this case.
Exactly. So asking one question at a time, you will routinely see, if you're paying close attention, or maybe not even close attention, people ask multiple run-on sequences of questions, such that when you get to the end of things, your client, your prospect, your colleague might say, well, which question do you want me to answer?
Guilty. I'm guilty of that. Yep. Guilty as charged.
When we do that, we confuse people. Plus, it really is making the point that you're making statements with that, like when you do that, when you could just have the discipline to ask one question. The second principle is to make it clear that it's a question. You'll often hear people say, well, I don't know if you have read our latest material. Now, is that a question?
Sort of. It doesn't feel like one, but it kind of is.
Right. But it will kind of close the conversation if you say, have you read our latest material? So if you say, have you read our latest material? They're going to say, well, yes, no. It's going to create a sense of discomfort with them. Like, oh, should I have read it? Or, oh, I feel bad I didn't read it. And, we all have so much coming at us. So I'll usually want to make that an open-ended question, like, hey, we sent you materials. How much time did you have to look at them?
Then it gives them an out too, because they're like, well, I've been super busy. Okay, no problem. You have them, right?
But if I say, hey, we sent you materials, did you read them? Which is another point to make about closed-ended questions is they're often like a poke in the chest. Did you read them?
Right.
Right. And so these are the things in language that we use, all these different ways of approaching conversations, and we can come across as really aggressive. Even the word why can be like, if not asked in a way that's collaborative, or if not in a sequence, why are you doing that? And we've all had critical people do that. Number 1, ask one question at a time. Number 2, make it clear that it's a question. Number 3, be concise in the way you ask it. If you remember in gymnastics, the concept stick the landing, right? Like you do this massive vault, you somersault 3 times and you stick the landing.
Yep.
One of the ways to make it clear that it's a question is to make it concise and stick the landing.
Tell me a little bit more about that, because I'm not sure I followed you there. I understand gymnastics, stick the landing, but in the context of this discussion, can you give us all an example of sticking the landing with a question, I guess?
What kind of example do you want?
I guess let's stick to let's pretend we're relationship managers at financial services.
That was the example.
Yep.
That was the example.
So what you consider sticking the landing, to me, I'm hearing it as a subjective thing. Like, I get concise. We all know what concise means. Maybe help me define what stick the landing in a more objective sense looks like. Because what you consider sticking the landing and what I consider sticking the landing may be different, I guess, here.
Okay, so first of all, that was the example of sticking the landings. What type of example would you like?
Oh, got it.
Okay.
Just got it now. Yeah.
But it's the way you do it. And this is why the analogy is rich. Like when you see Mary Lou Retton is what comes to mind from.
Oh yeah, I remember Mary. Yeah.
1984.
Yeah.
So when you get a 10 in gymnastics, that landing is stuck. And so to give you an example, it's just simply like the conviction behind the question is, I'm going to stop here because this is my power question, or it's a powerful question. It's clear that it's a question, and boom, the landing is stuck. So
there's no ambiguity. The person on the other end knows, pause. It's up to them to answer.
Right. Like even your favorite question right now, Alex, what do you think is going to happen in the future?
Boom.
Because for it to be, and this is the fourth point, for it to be a useful vehicle for you, you have to provide time for the answer to the question. And that's another thing is people will ask a question and then they'll immediately start talking and not even let the person answer. So when you ask it in a concise manner and you stick the landing, you're also kind of indicating to them and to yourself, I'm going to wait until you put out the answer.
Yeah. Yeah. And that shows a lot of respect in my mind. It shows a ton of respect to just stop completely and let them go as long as they want within reason.
And both of us over time have learned that we're going to be much more effective when we talk less versus more. I mean, especially in the cold calling that you have to do. If you talk for the first 2 to 5 minutes of the conversation, are you going to get anywhere?
I would say no. If they're talking 2 to 5 minutes, then that's a huge green flag. Probably going to be a good call.
Right. All right. Well, Alex, we've covered a lot of material. Is there any closing statement that you'd like to make?
Yeah, I have another quote, and this one's anonymous, but I think it's another, I wouldn't call it a zinger. It's just one that I really thought about a lot as I was preparing for this podcast with you. And it's knowledge is having the right answer, but intelligence is asking the right question. Your questions are actually more important than the answer.
Well, I'm going to close with a quote as well.
Okay.
And delightfully, you went first, which gave me time to think about a quote. I'm going to quote Mr. William Shakespeare. And he said, "To be or not to be, that is the question."
Love it.
And I choose that quote because to be skillful in using questions or not to be skillful in the use of questions is fundamental. And it's why I made it chapter 2 of my book. Certainly, it all starts with rapport, and that's why rapports and building rapport is chapter 1. But building on building rapport is using questions skillfully. And that really is to be effective or not to be effective, or to be in control or not be in control of a conversation, or to be in harmony, to be collaborating. Alex, thank you for being a part of this very important conversation about conversations.
Thanks for having me.